Welcome to Ethics Online. Thank you for joining me this semester. I hope that this brief presentation that follows will serve to introduce you basically to ethics as we understand it from an academic or philosophical point of view. But at the same time, I hope you realize that so much of what we understand by ethics and so much of the concepts that we're going to be discussing are applicable to our daily lives. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome. Here begins a brief overview, and I'll try to make it extremely brief, so as not to bore you. But here's an overview of ethics, and hopefully it'll be a kind of guideline as we learn about the major philosophical and ethical traditions that have dominated ethical thinking for probably over 2,000 years. I'm Douglas Borkeman, your facilitator this semester. I'd like to discuss with you what ethics is. And in addition to that, we have to entertain these following questions as well. What is it to be a moral person? What is the nature of morality? Why in the world do we need morality? What function does morality play? And how do I know what is a good? And I want you to think about that last one for a moment, because it's probably worded in such a way that it does not sound too terribly familiar, a little bit of an odd turn of phrase. How do I know what is the good? Another way of saying it, how do I know what's ultimately valuable? Ethics can be described in many ways, indirectly and directly. Indirectly by just raising further questions about it and trying to answer those questions directly. When we think about ethics, we think about things such as moral principles and whether or not they're absolute, or whether they are relative to social groups or individual decisions. Is morality only in the view of the person who is being moral or perceiving moral behavior? Might there be a time to act immorally, you or me, under certain circumstances? How can I justify my moral beliefs? And of course, it's the justification of moral beliefs. It's mostly a philosophical enterprise, because typically in philosophy, what we do is provide arguments that justify our claims. So as we progress philosophically, it's going to be a little bit more than just simply how we feel or how we were raised, but rather how we are able to argue to justify our moral beliefs. We also ask these questions. What's the basis of morality? There are many ethical theories, by the way, and we want to ask the question, which ethical theory best justifies and explains moral life? Now, the three main theories that we discuss are virtue, ethics, utilitarianism, and deontology, but between and amongst them, there are many more, and I'll have other presentations that will cover those as well. What is morality's relationship to religion, law, or even social etiquette? This presupposes that ethics and religion are not the same thing, ethics and law are not the same thing, and certainly ethics and social etiquette are not the same thing, but there is some kind of a conceptual relationship between and among all of these things. The term moral, let's deal with that for just a moment. This comes from both the Latin meaning, which is more, mores, and the Greek meaning, ethos, ethos. And of course, each derives their meaning from the idea of custom. So if the ancient Greeks would talk about the ethoi or ethos of another cultural civilization that perhaps they were about to conquer, they would be talking principally about customs. But we, of course, mean something a little bit beyond that when we discuss and discourse about ethical and moral issues these days. Morality is a term that very succinctly refers to customs, precepts, practices of peoples and cultures. And we divide that into positive or descriptive morality and other kinds of morality as well, such as prescriptive. Positive or descriptive morality is used to describe actual beliefs and customs of culture. So this is rather like what anthropologists do when they go into a culture or region and they just simply report or observe the mores, if you will, or the ethos of a particular tribe or a particular region, a social group. Could be in the United States, could be somewhere else throughout the world. And again, they're looking at customs and precepts, moral principles, and the practices. That's what we would call descriptive morality. How about moral philosophy? What is that? Well, that now is more properly what we're going to be dealing with here. Moral philosophy refers to philosophical or theoretical reflection on morality. And most of your authors put terms like these, use terms such as ethical theories to cover moral philosophy. And these theories, of course, are generated from moral and philosophical reflections. So, in other words, moral philosophy tends to go beyond just simply the observation of and description of mores and customs and precepts and beliefs that ground them in a specific culture as observed. into a more speculative domain. Now, if we want to refine this even further, the term ethics refers to the whole domain of morality and moral philosophy. So it is clearly a broader category in which moral philosophy and morality fit under it, and it is therefore somewhat more abstract, yet there is an applied aspect also to ethics. Both areas are connected by common concerns in different ways through values, virtues, principles, and practices. So again, getting back to moral philosophy, this can be described as a systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and justify moral principles and theories. Ethics, in other words, incorporates moral philosophy into its reflective modality. Moral philosophy analyzes concepts in terms such as right or wrong or ought and good and evil. I'm sure these are terms that you probably encounter just about every single day of your life, which is what can make this a really exhilarating and interesting subject for study. Moral philosophy also seeks to establish principles of right behavior to serve as a guide for individuals and groups. So it does have a kind of a prescriptive, as we would say, nature. It wants to provide, moral philosophy that is, wants to provide and establish and justify principles of right behavior. And it also investigates which values and virtues are important for a worthwhile life in society. So a moral philosopher is a person who engages in these kinds of activities, and certainly one worthy pursuit, would you not think, would be coming up with what produces a worthwhile life in a society or culture. Moral precepts are concerned with social norms. And let's talk a little bit about normative. The term normative basically has a value-laden aspect to it. A normative, morality insofar as it has a normative aspect, provides a distinctly guiding function. And this, of course, is shared by religion, law, and social etiquette as well. However, morality functions differently in religion, law, and social etiquette. It's not, in other words, doesn't function the same way in all three of those main subdivisions. If we focus a little bit now on each one of those and start with religion, morality in religion presumably is captured by religion, but it is not the same as. So in other words, the point here is that simply because a religion prescribes some norm of conduct, let us say, it doesn't necessarily follow that it is indeed moral or an ethical assertion or principle or precept or guideline. In other words, religion and morality are not the same thing. They are not coextensive, but you do find that the major world religions certainly embrace morality. And I think if you look more deeply at almost all of the major religions of the world, you'll discover that there's quite a bit of commonality, not so much metaphysically, which is another branch of philosophy, but in terms of the ethics that are promoted there. The moral principles are grounded in revelation and divine authority of that religious belief system. Usually, if we're talking about religion, we are talking about the source and origination of something, for example, like the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, or perhaps the Pillars of Islam. Not so much true of Buddhism, but still you do have a revelation of sorts that occurs because of Buddha's great insight that he had when he was meditating for 7 days under the Bo tree, at least in a legendary, if not historical way. These are revelations of sort. They may come from a divine authority or from something that is above and beyond mere human experience. Religion usually does incorporate reference to the divine, and it is the divine that is the wellspring of moral principles in this context. Now, how about in distinction here, in contrast, morality and law? Why do we have laws? Well, generally they're instituted to promote social and individual well-being, and of course to help us resolve conflicts of interest and promote social harmony. And again, law usually reaches out to try to embrace something like morality, but as in the case of religion and morality and law are not coextensive. One of the reasons we actually find ourselves changing our laws is because we have some new insight into morality and or ethics. Ethics may judge that some laws are immoral without denying that those same laws are valid laws. So this happens, I think, regularly when we're undergoing social change and we're trying to perhaps improve some aspect of our culture or society. Perhaps there'll be a great leader that rises to the occasion that suggests that some of the practices like gender discrimination, as one example, as but one, is immoral, and so we change the law accordingly. Law and morality, therefore, truly do differ, and they differ according to some extent to the concept of intent. Bad intentions, otherwise known in Latin as mens rea, is factored into the legality of a criminal act. So in other words, if you commit a crime, typically in a legal environment, it has to do with whether or not you intended to do it. You may accidentally commit a mistake, but if you intended to do something against the law, that's an entirely different way of thinking. But no one can be punished for only thinking bad thoughts according to law. So in law, there has to be mens rea plus the activity that goes with it. Otherwise, it's not really breaking law at all. You can, in other words, feel free to think the way you see fit. And some of this thinking could be, in fact, judged by some standards as immoral, but it only becomes a legal issue when you act upon the thinking. The enforcement of law, as opposed to morality typically, has physical imprisonment and sometimes financial fines or sanctions. But with regard to morality, only sanctions of conscience or reputation enforce morality, typically. I'm not saying that this is universally true, but I think that it's a very good insight that's been handed down to us, that there is an enforcement of law, but there's not usually an enforcement of morality except in extreme cases, and we probably do experience some of those extreme cases somewhere in the world, even as we speak on this issue. How about morality and etiquette? Etiquette really is pretty much about politeness and how to show a certain kind of attitude and behavior, and certainly does vary regionally from social culture, from social stratum to social stratum. Morality determines what's correct or right social behavior, and it can be that not obeying social custom in some cases can be considered immoral, but it depends on how far it goes, as I'm sure you'll know. And for many of you, and I'm sure those of you who are taking courses online and hybridized format or 100% online, are probably accessing your course materials from a variety of places throughout the world, and probably get exposed quite a bit to different etiquette, standards of etiquette. And in some cases, etiquette in an extreme situation can produce a moral judgment or evaluation. Religion, law, and etiquette do have limitations in society, whatever society it is. Religion does rest on the authority that some people may question. Not everybody, in other words, believes in the same divinity or the same God or the same set of precepts that are associated with it. Law. Certainly every social ill does not have a law, and rules cannot be always enforced. The freeway is a very good example of that, and I think you will have forthcoming a presentation on Kantian deontology in which I discuss its application to freeway driving. And there is a moral issue there with something as simple as freeway driving, or simplistic as that, because I think it's kind of a metaphor or paradigm of how it is that we behave and are expected to behave. But there are some moral issues and there's some legal issues on the freeway and other places in life, and those two things sometimes need to be separated out. You can recognize that the law says one thing, but maybe morality commands something different, or vice versa. Etiquette doesn't go into the depth of what is existentially important. When we say that there's something existentially important about religion and law and morality per se, but etiquette usually seems to have a somewhat more superficial look to it. What are some of the traits of moral principles? Central to morality are moral principles which have these 5 traits: prescriptivity, universalizability, overridingness, publicity, and practicability. Now, these are really theoretically appropriate characteristics of moral principles. You may indeed disagree with them, and perhaps some ethicists and philosophers out there don't necessarily accept all of them. But I think after great scholars have culled through the considerable amount of moral theorizing that has been done over the past thousands of years in just about every culture, East and West, it's easy to come to this conclusion that good moral principles should be prescriptive, universalizable. There should be a certain overridingness that is associated with it. It should be able to be made public, and it should also be something that you can actually do, which is or put into action, which is where practicability comes in. Let's go into some of this in a little bit more detail now. What does prescriptivity really mean? Well, this refers to the practice or action that guides the nature of morality. And in this particular situation, a moral principle, a good moral principle, actually prescribes or advises and influences our action. That's what it means to be prescriptive rather than just simply descriptive. Prescriptivity. This is where you talk about things such as what should one do, what I ought to do. That's a prescriptive mode of assertion. Universalizability. Moral principles must apply to all who are relatively in relatively the same situation. That's what it means to be universalizable. In other words, what's good for me is also good for you in the public domain. And of course, we must be consistent, and they must apply to all evaluative judgments. So moral principles, again, moral principles are something that generally are viewed as a little bit beyond just simply the immediate circumstance you find yourself in, although it's true that circumstances can cause a otherwise objective universalizable precept to kind of mutate a little bit. You know, you do have to sometimes make a decision about whether or not you're going to act on universal principles, or maybe just for the sake of survival, change it ever so slightly. But in general, and that's what we're talking about here, in general, these are the characteristics of universalizability. And universalizability is a feature of a moral principle. Overridingness, an authority that takes precedence over other considerations, including aesthetic, prudential, legal concerns. So when you say that overriding, there are certain things sometimes, and you'll see this, I think, as the course proceeds, that some principles override other principles. I mean, in certain circumstances, of course, you know, you shouldn't lie, let us say. Most of us believe that we shouldn't lie. There are times, however, where we maybe do quote-unquote white lying, which is usually not regarded by our culture, as far as I know, as a really serious form of severe lying, but it's still a lie. A white lie is still a lie, is it not? The overridingness of the principle, thou shalt not lie, let us say, and that could be expressed very differently. I'm expressing it in the more archaic format, but most religions and certainly most societies cohere because they believe that lying is not appropriate. So prescriptively, thou shalt not lie, or you shouldn't lie, however that gets expressed as a prescription, an assertion about what we should or should not do, overrides other considerations. So it has a higher status, so to speak. Publicity. Moral principles must be known by all, or at least must be capable of being known by all. That's what it means to make them public. You can't just have your own moral principle in secret. It would tend to defeat the purpose of having a moral principle in the first place, because the idea is, at least in part, the supposition about ethics, given the publicity aspect of it, is that it sort of helps our society to cohere. It helps us to live together. So it's important for us to announce and not hide our moral principles so that everybody knows them. Again, I can allude to some of the allegedly divinely revealed principles, such as those that are in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, for example, in the Old Testament, shared by the major Middle Eastern traditions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, or Buddhism, such as, for example, the Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Taoism, Confucianism all have their versions of this, as does, to some extent, Greek ethics. How about practicability? This basically boils down to, if you have a moral precept or principle, you should be able to actually put it into actions. They must be workable in general society. They can't ask too much of you. They have to take human limitation into consideration. And, of course, things do change throughout time, so sometimes what may have been practicable in terms of an ethical or moral principle that used to be observed, let us say, in a culture 100 years ago, or in our society, let us say, in the West, in the U.S., for example, 150 years ago, perhaps it's no longer practicable. And I say perhaps, because there will be different views about that, but you have to at least hold on to the notion that whatever it is, it's a moral principle, in fact, could be acted upon. That's really what practicability means. In other words, it doesn't ask you to do the impossible. How do we assess certain kinds of things that have to do with ethics? And I might add morality as well. There are 4 domains which evaluate rules of right conduct, generally speaking, and we have different theories that we'll be studying which are set up to focus on one or more of these a little bit more than the others that are included here. There's the domain of action, the domain of consequences, the domain of character, and the domain of motive. And these may not be completely exhaustive, but it provides fairly good and comprehensive coverage of the domains that we're talking about when we talk about right conduct. A little bit more detail on action. We usually say that actions are right or wrong. And, of course, right can be an ambiguous term. It can mean either that it's obligatory or it's permissible. In other words, it's right to do because you are obliged to do it, or it's right to do because there's nothing that tells you you can't do it. So it's permissible under those circumstances. There's also another aspect to this, an optional act, an act not obligatory or wrong, that is to say permissible. like not doing your duty or not to do something else. Obligatory act, an act you must do. You're required to do it. You may not refrain from doing it. So again, if we have a certain situation in which we absolutely must try to save a person who might be suffocating or apply CPR, sometimes this does depend upon what your position is and your job is, and there might be an ethic specifically associated with your job or your occupation or your profession. That would be regarded as obligatory, but there's some things that actually are over and above that our culture requires us to do. Again, arguably, like not cheating, not stealing, things like that. We are required not to do those things. Optional acts are those that you're not really running the risk of bringing upon yourself some kind of a disastrous moral judgment. It's not something you must do. It's just optional, permissible. How about wrong acts? I'm sure that we all commit these. I know I do periodically. One has an obligation or duty to refrain from doing a wrong act. Another way of putting it, you shouldn't do the action at all if it's wrong. And of course, if you say something is outright wrong, it's not even permissible to do it. Now, we find later that some of these very strong or stringent ways of looking at morality or wrong acts, under certain circumstances, situationally, do get bent a little bit. And so what is a wrong act to do under most circumstances might be an appropriate thing to do under specific circumstances. What is this wonderful word here, which maybe you've heard before? Supererogatory. These are actions that are usually heroic. These are actions that are within a range of permissible acts. They're altruistic. Altruism is a word that means selfless or other-directed, directed at the welfare of somebody else who's going to be the beneficiary of an act that you might be on the verge of committing. They're not required. Heroic acts are not required. Self-sacrifice is typically not required, although there may be circumstances under which it would be seen as obligatory. Supererogatory acts exceed what morality requires, meaning, again, that they're more selfless. They are above and beyond the call of duty. Deontological actions. Now, we'll study this in more detail as we study the probably best example and spokesperson for this, Mr. Immanuel Kant. Deon is from the Greek word which means duties, and a deontological theory emphasizes the nature of an action. They hold that there's something inherently good or right about certain actions and wrong or bad about other actions, and that you have a duty once you find out what is right to do it. That's what deontology, strictly speaking, is about. But we'll get into more detail because there's much nuance of meaning and many different ways to go, and many other implications too, aside from just simply this rather superficial introduction. There's the ethics of consequences. This has to do with actions that are based on a foreseeable outcome of a course of decision. And theories that focus on consequences and determine what morally right or moral are termed teleological ethical theories. Telos is Greek and means goal-directed. And you get words like telephone, television. Goal or end is what telos means in Greek. So we're primarily looking at the consequences or the end result of our actions, as opposed to the idea that they're just simply duties that you do in and of themselves. The ethics of character. This is mostly Greek virtue ethics. Character reflects, under this view, actions that emphasize virtue, and we'll discuss in great detail with Aristotle in particular his concept of the golden mean and how to become virtuous, what the prescription is for virtue. Virtue empowers character to do good. Virtue, in other words, is a characteristic of a person who has good character. Most moral theories consider virtue important, but virtue is not always central to all moral theories. So, in some cases, it's the consequences. That would be a utilitarian teleological theory. In other cases, it's your duty. In the case of character, it's mostly about the kind of person that you are. And if you are a better person, the likelihood here is that you will cultivate virtues, and because of that fact, develop a habitual attitude towards doing the right thing, and you'll be a better person. Slightly different ways of looking at our moral description of agency, moral agency. One focuses, let us say, one theory maybe focuses more on consequences of the act itself, another focuses more on a person doing the acts. How about motive? Moral actions take into account the intention or motivation of the actor prior to the act itself. and a full assessment of that considers intention or motive. So in other words, you do, certainly in law, but in this area of discourse and morality, we take a look at what we intended to do as well. What was your mind state? What did you really want to accomplish? You may have ended up doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. That would be morally suspect with respect to identifying motives. Why do we need morality? It may seem like an almost oxymoronic sort of question to ask. Why do we need morality? Is there a need for morality? Does it seem just patently obvious that we need it? But there have been many responses to a question such as this. And if you think about the famous Thomas Hobbes, he said that humans create a social contract or covenant to create a standard of social morals to counteract our state of nature as he saw humanity. So, you know, in philosophy we have several different branches. We're discussing for this course mostly ethics, but another one is metaphysics. And to some extent metaphysics deals with what is the case, what is really out there, what is reality really like. And a metaphysical question is, what are human beings really like? And of course Hobbes assumed that the state of nature for human beings wasn't a terribly positive thing, that there's a degree to which we are kind of inherently wired to be somewhat greedy and self-serving. And so for him, being the social contractarian that he was, he felt that we needed to all get together and decide upon a standard so as to sort of improve the condition for all of us and, in a sense, kind of keep us from ourselves as well. Keep down those instincts for doing injustice and evil to your fellow man. What is the purpose of morality? Well, morality is a force in humanity that can keep us within a human behavior that advocates decency and respect. Morals are a set of rules that if everyone follows them, nearly everyone will flourish. So the term flourish comes up often in Greek thought, but it's a good word here. Flourish roughly means to flower, to grow, to develop. So one of the things that morality does when we all agree upon some standard of morality is to help us all live together better and individually also do better. And there may be quite a few moral theories that actually try to accomplish that in different ways. Rules of morality restrain our freedom in order to promote greater freedom. This is the contract view, actually, and well-being for us and all of society. There are usually 5 purposes of morals that are related, but they're certainly not all identical. We can identify these, and you might be able to come up, and I invite you to think of a few more. To keep society from falling apart, to ameliorate human suffering, to promote human flourishing, to resolve conflict of interest justly in an orderly manner, to assign praise, blame, reward, punishment, guilt in society. So, you know, if nothing else, moral principles and a good, suitable moral framework probably helps to accomplish many of these things. Think about how, you know, what you know of morality functions in your life. In your professional life and in your private life, and indeed sometimes between those two there can be a lot of conflict and different obligations, and sometimes because of that conflict a person has a genuine stress-producing situation when they're trying to decide what they should or shouldn't do. One goal of or some goals of morality would be to create happy, virtuous people. Happy has a unique context here. It doesn't necessarily mean always feeling really good. I mean, you can feel really good in a drug-induced state, and it has nothing to do with morality, or could be just the opposite of some moral calling or precept. To create and support flourishing communities based on order and justice, to provide guidelines for people to achieve the above, to promote the good of morality. So, in other words, it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. Once you set up a morality or moral framework that presumably abides by the principles that we mentioned, such as publicity, universalizability, prescriptivity, etc., then you have a basis upon which to get a society, culture, a region or group or tribe, however you wish to describe it, as functioning coherently for the sake of the greater good, as well as for the sake of the individual within that greater good. Now, this is where it might be arguable. When you think about it, I like to say that you're probably not going to be able to do, think, or act almost in any way at any point in time without there being some potential for a moral judgment, evaluation, or some implication. It may be arguably true that morality is at least among the most important subjects on earth. It's not easy to see how we could promote the good of all of people that are counted as human beings. And of course, we do extend that in environmental ethics to ecosystems, to animals, other creatures aside from humans as well. So it may not be just simply for the good of humanity, it might be for the good of the environment, the good of ecosystems generally speaking. The idea behind objective morality is that moral rules are not merely relative, because if they were, then it would be entirely up to each individual group to decide upon them. And sometimes I know we talk that way, but think about the implications of that for a moment. I won't say it's right, wrong, or I agree or disagree with the idea that moral rules are relative, but they probably are not in the long run. But you are going to have to decide that yourself. They're not totally absolute, because sometimes moral principles can override each other, and if they were simply absolute, then one would always have a greater calling than another. But sometimes what happens is that one will override another given the circumstances. And again, I would leave it to you to try to figure a scheme of things in which, a scenario in which maybe one rule would override another. Public PBS system has a really interesting link that has been placed up in the course called Endgame. And it's basically a scenario in which a person finds herself involved in a situation in which I think you can tell that clearly there's a moral obligation, but there's certainly some overridingness that has to be construed as important in the scenario as well. And I invite you to take a look at that when you have an opportunity. You should be able to scroll through the course and find the appropriate link.